You know how people always say you can't control nature no matter how much money or power you have? Well, let me tell you something, the HOA in my neighborhood didn't get that memo. Because when a hurricane ripped through our coastal town and left almost every house destroyed except mine, somehow they decided it was my fault. They accused me of causing the hurricane just because my house survived. And then they demanded $10 million in damages as if I was some kind of wizard who summoned a storm. Let me start from the beginning so you understand just how insane this story really is. I had moved into this community about 5 years before the storm hit. It was one of those gated neighborhoods with big stone entrances, perfectly manicured lawns, and of course an HOA that thought they were the government. From day one I could tell they were the kind of people who measured your grass with a ruler and sent you fines if your trash bins were visible for more than 30 seconds. But I worked hard and I had always wanted a place near the coast, so I told myself I could handle a little HOA nonsense if it meant living in my dream home. Now here's the thing about my house. Unlike most of the other homes in the neighborhood, mine wasn't built by the same cookie-cutter developer. I had found an old lot that had been sitting empty and I brought in my own contractor. We built it with reinforced concrete walls, impact-resistant glass, hurricane straps on the roof, and a backup generator. It cost me more up front, but I wanted peace of mind. Everyone else thought I was overreacting. Neighbors would laugh and say, "Why spend all that extra money? The HOA houses are good enough and nothing ever happens here." But I grew up in Florida, I knew better. Storms always come sooner or later. And then that summer the monster came. They called it Hurricane Ezra, the biggest storm in 50 years. When the warnings went out, most of the neighborhood shrugged it off. Some evacuated last minute, but plenty stayed thinking it would just be another tropical storm. Me though, I followed every safety protocol. Boarded up the weaker spots, secured the generator, stocked water and food, and got my family out to stay with relatives inland. I was the last one to leave my house that night, and I remember looking back thinking, I hope all this work pays off. When the storm finally hit, it was like the world itself was ending. Winds over 150 miles an hour, waves surging up the streets, ripping out trees, roofs flying off houses like paper plates. The news helicopters showed images of entire blocks flattened. And when it was all over 2 days later, the neighborhood looked like a war zone. Every house in sight was shredded, collapsed, or flooded beyond repair. Except mine. My house stood tall like a stubborn rock, surrounded by piles of rubble. Not a broken window, not a missing shingle. It was exactly how I had designed it to be, storm-proof. When I drove back in with the first wave of returning residents, I thought maybe people would be relieved that at least one house made it. I thought maybe my place could be a safe spot for neighbors to regroup while they figured out insurance and repairs. But I was wrong. The looks I got weren't thankful, they were suspicious. People stared at my house like it was some kind of monster that had betrayed them by staying whole while theirs were gone. And then came the HOA. Their president, a woman named Deborah, who everyone called Hurricane Karen behind her back, showed up at my door with 2 board members. Her hair was perfectly styled even though everything around us was destroyed. She had on heels like she was walking into a courtroom. She didn't say, "I'm glad you're okay." She didn't ask if my family was safe. Instead, she crossed her arms and said, "We need to talk about what you've done." At first I thought she meant maybe helping with supplies or organizing cleanup. But no, she leaned in and said in the most serious tone you can imagine, "Your house surviving when every other one fell makes it suspicious. We've spoken to the board and there's reason to believe your construction interfered with wind patterns and caused damage to the rest of the neighborhood." I laughed out loud because how do you even respond to that? Interfered with wind patterns, are you kidding me? But she wasn't smiling. She slid a piece of paper into my hand. It was an official HOA violation notice. According to them, my home had created a wind tunnel effect that increased the destruction. And therefore under HOA bylaws I was liable for damages to the entire community. The number at the bottom of the notice was $10 million. $10 million. I read it 3 times because I thought maybe I was still sleep-deprived from the storm. But it was real. They wanted me to pay for everyone else's destroyed homes because mine had been built properly. I told Deborah she was out of her mind. I told her the only reason my house survived was because I built it right. But she sneered and said that in a community everyone rises and falls together. And when one person builds against HOA guidelines, it can create consequences for everyone. I reminded her that the HOA had approved my construction years ago. But she smirked and said approvals can be revisited under extraordinary circumstances. Then she turned on her heel and walked away like she had just won a courtroom battle. That was only the beginning. Within hours, other residents started whispering about how suspicious it was that my house was untouched. Some said I must have bribed inspectors. Others claimed I had installed secret technology. One man even shouted at me that I must have summoned the storm like some kind of witch. It was unreal. Insurance adjusters came in to survey the wreckage, and when they saw my house still standing, they asked a lot of questions too. I showed them the reinforced walls, the roof strapping the impact glass. They nodded and said it made sense. But the HOA wasn't letting up. They called an emergency board meeting in the parking lot of the ruined clubhouse. And when I showed up, half the neighborhood was there glaring at me. Deborah stood on a folding chair like a general rallying her troops. She said the evidence was clear. My house had disrupted the natural flow of the storm and the HOA bylaws allowed them to levy collective damages. She even tried to make it sound noble, saying if I really cared about the community I would pay up and help rebuild. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. People had lost everything, and instead of blaming nature they were blaming me. I stood up and told them the truth. That I had built my house stronger because I knew this could happen. That they could have done the same if they hadn't cut corners and relied on the cheapest builders. But no one wanted to hear it. They booed me. One woman threw a bottle of water at my feet and shouted, "Which house, which house?" By the time I got home I knew this wasn't just going to blow over. Deborah slipped another letter under my door, this time saying if I didn't agree to pay the $10 million voluntarily they would take me to court. She signed it with that smug flourish of hers like she thought she was untouchable. But what she didn't know was I had kept every document, every approval, every construction permit, and I was ready for a fight. If they wanted war they were going to get one. And that was just day one of the madness. The weeks that followed turned into a nightmare of accusations, legal threats, and even sabotage attempts against my house. The HOA wasn't just trying to take my money, they were trying to make me the villain of the hurricane. And little did they know I was just getting started fighting back. You'd think after a natural disaster people would come together, rebuild as one community, and help each other heal. But in my neighborhood, thanks to the HOA, it turned into something much darker. Instead of pulling together, they pulled their pitchforks out and pointed them straight at me. The morning after Deborah slipped that threat letter under my door, I walked outside and saw something that made my stomach turn. Someone had spray painted across my garage in huge red letters, "Storm Witch Pay Up." My heart dropped because that wasn't just a petty HOA fine anymore, that was an attack. And my kids were supposed to come back home soon. How was I supposed to explain that to them? I grabbed a bucket and started scrubbing it off, but the paint was oil-based. It took hours, and even then a faint shadow of the words remained like a scar on my house. That same afternoon I went to see my lawyer, a sharp guy named Randall who had dealt with HOA lawsuits before. He listened quietly while I explained everything from the accusation to the $10 million demand to the vandalism. When I finished he leaned back in his chair and let out a long whistle. Then he said, "This is insane but not surprising." He explained that after disasters HOAs sometimes try to blame individual homeowners to deflect attention from their own failures. If the HOA approved cheap construction that collapsed in a storm they could be liable. But if they pinned the blame on me they could protect themselves. In other words, this was never about me summoning a hurricane, this was about covering their backsides. Randall promised he'd file an injunction to stop any immediate legal action against me. But he also warned me the HOA had money and connections and they would try to drag me through the mud publicly. He told me to document everything, keep my cameras on, and prepare for a long, ugly fight. I left his office with a pit in my stomach but also a spark of determination. I wasn't about to let Deborah and her cronies steal $10 million from me. That night the harassment escalated. Around midnight I heard banging on my front door. When I checked the camera feed I saw a group of neighbors standing there holding flashlights chanting, "Pay the 10 million, pay the 10 million." It was like some twisted cult ritual. I didn't open the door, I just called the police. When the officers finally showed up they didn't arrest anyone, they just told the crowd to go home. And get this, one of the officers actually looked at me and said, "You know, if you just cooperated this wouldn't be happening." Cooperated as in hand over $10 million. It was insane. The next day Deborah sent out a mass email to the entire neighborhood. In it she wrote that my house had been identified as a structural hazard to the community. She claimed its survival was unnatural and potentially dangerous to rebuilding efforts. She even went so far as to suggest my house should be condemned and demolished for the good of everyone else. When I read those words I nearly threw my laptop across the room. She wanted my house gone. The one place that had actually survived the storm she wanted leveled. But then something strange happened. The story got picked up by a local news station. A reporter heard about one surviving house being blamed by the HOA and came to interview me. I showed them the damage around the neighborhood, I showed them my building permits, and I walked them through the storm-proof features of my home. They filmed the red spray paint still faint on my garage, they filmed the angry emails and the ridiculous fine notice. When the segment aired that night the response exploded. Half the viewers thought it was the most ridiculous thing they had ever heard. The other half thought I really was some sort of storm magnate who had cursed the neighborhood. The HOA had succeeded in making me infamous. After that the harassment only grew worse. Strangers drove by just to gawk. One woman threw a bag of trash over my fence yelling, "Curse breaker." Another man hammered a sign into my yard that said which house condemned. I called the police again, but they shrugged it off. Meanwhile, Deborah basked in the spotlight. She gave her own interview where she called me reckless and dangerous. She said I had selfishly built a fortress that disrupted the natural balance of the community and that I owed it to my neighbors to make things right. But while she was ranting on TV, Randall was working behind the scenes. He dug up all the construction approvals the HOA had signed off on. He found meeting minutes where Deborah herself had voted yes on my building plans years ago. And he found something even juicier. He discovered that before the storm, the HOA had cut corners on the clubhouse repairs, pocketing part of the insurance payout from a previous flood. If that came to light, the whole board could be in serious trouble. And that gave us leverage. Randall filed a lawsuit not just defending me but accusing the HOA of fraud and harassment. The filing claimed the $10 million demand was baseless and designed to distract from their own misconduct. We served the papers at the next HOA meeting. I'll never forget the look on Deborah's face when Randall walked in and handed her that thick envelope. She tried to keep her composure, but her hands trembled as she read the first page. You'd think at that point the HOA would back down, but no, they doubled down. They called another emergency meeting, this time at the temporary tent they had set up where the clubhouse used to be. When I showed up, the atmosphere was hostile. Deborah stood on stage with a microphone, painting me as the villain again. She claimed I was suing the community in their time of need. She waved the lawsuit papers in the air like they were proof of my evil. The crowd booed and jeered, some shouted that I should be banished. It was like a witch trial in the middle of a hurricane-ravaged suburb. But then Randall stepped up beside me. He didn't need a microphone, his voice cut through the noise. He laid out the facts calmly. That my house had been built to code and approved by the HOA. That the storm was an act of nature, not sabotage. That the HOA had failed to maintain common property properly and misused funds. He ended by saying if they wanted a war in court they were going to lose badly. The room went dead silent. For the first time I saw fear flicker in Deborah's eyes. After that meeting things shifted slightly. Some neighbors started quietly approaching me, saying maybe they had gone too far, maybe Deborah was pushing this out of control. But the hardliners still hissed whenever I walked past. It was a neighborhood divided right down the middle. And Deborah was not about to give up. She started sending building inspectors to my house every other day looking for violations. One inspector even tried to claim my hurricane shutters were illegal modifications despite the fact that they had been approved. Randall shut that down quickly, but it was obvious they were trying to bury me in paperwork and stress. Then came the sabotage. One night my generator was mysteriously shut off and wires were cut. Another time someone loosened the bolts on my front gate. It was getting dangerous. I installed more cameras, I bought stronger locks, I even considered hiring private security. This wasn't just about money anymore, this was about safety. Through it all my house stood strong, but I could feel the weight of the neighborhood pressing in on me. Every time I looked out the window I saw eyes watching. Every time I checked the mail I expected another threat. And in the middle of all that chaos the court finally set a hearing date. The HOA versus me. $10 million on the line and my reputation hanging by a thread. Deborah thought she had me cornered, but she didn't know the evidence Randall had stacked against her. And I was ready to bring it all out into the open. The court date arrived faster than I expected, and I swear it felt like I was walking into the final act of some twisted play that had been running far too long. For weeks the HOA had made me into their villain, they painted me as the reason for all their suffering, they demanded $10 million like it was pocket change, and they pushed every dirty trick they could think of to break me. But this was the day everything would finally come out in the open. I remember standing in front of the courthouse early that morning. My house had survived a hurricane, but this felt like a storm of its own. Reporters were lined up outside, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in my face, asking if I really believed I could win against the HOA. Some shouted questions like, did you summon the storm? Are you a weather manipulator? Do you regret not settling? I didn't answer any of them. I just walked in with Randall by my side and my evidence folder tucked under my arm like a shield. Inside the courtroom the HOA board sat together in a row, looking smug like a pack of vultures ready for a feast. Deborah sat in the middle wearing a bright red blazer that practically screamed I am in charge. She had that same tight smile she always wore, the one that said she thought she'd already won. Her lawyer, a tall man with slicked back hair and too much cologne, leaned toward her whispering like they were planning their victory parade. When the judge entered the room everyone stood. The gavel came down and just like that the storm began. The HOA's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of me as a reckless, selfish homeowner who had ignored community guidelines and built a fortress that disrupted the natural wind flow of the neighborhood. He claimed my house created a dangerous wind tunnel effect, amplifying the hurricane's destruction. He pulled out charts and diagrams that looked like they had been drawn by a high school student, but he spoke with the confidence of a man trying to sell a lie as truth. When he finished, some of the neighbors sitting in the audience actually clapped. Deborah gave me that smug glance that said checkmate. Then it was Randall's turn. He walked calmly to the center of the courtroom and started with the simplest fact of all. My house was built to code and every single design choice had been approved by the HOA board, including Deborah herself. He held up the signed documents, meeting minutes, and approval letters for everyone to see. Then he moved on to the storm-proof features, showing photos and construction reports. He explained how hurricane straps worked, how reinforced concrete held up against winds, and why impact-resistant glass mattered. The jury leaned forward, listening closely. It wasn't complicated, it was just good engineering and common sense. Then came the moment Randall had been waiting for. He pulled out the HOA's financial records that he had dug up through discovery. He showed how funds meant for clubhouse repairs years ago had been misused. He revealed emails between board members discussing ways to cover up the missing money. He explained how the HOA had a motive to pin blame on me to distract from their own negligence and corruption. The room shifted immediately. You could feel the weight of the evidence crushing their story. Deborah's smile cracked for the first time. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, who suddenly looked a lot less confident. Then Randall brought in the big guns. He called an expert meteorologist to the stand. This wasn't just some random scientist, this was a man who had spent his life studying hurricanes. The expert looked at the jury and said flat out, no single house could cause or redirect a storm of that magnitude. The idea was laughable. Nature doesn't work that way, he said, and anyone claiming otherwise is either ignorant or lying. That testimony landed like a thunderclap. Even some of the HOA supporters in the audience shifted uncomfortably. By the time Randall rested our case, the tide had turned completely. The HOA looked like fools grasping at straws, while we looked like the only ones telling the truth. But Deborah wasn't done yet. She demanded to testify herself. She strutted up to the stand like she was walking onto a stage, determined to put on one last performance. She gave a speech about community unity, about how my selfishness had divided everyone, about how she was only trying to protect her neighbors. She even teared up at one point, pretending to cry into a tissue. But Randall was ready for her. When it came time for cross-examination, he didn't hold back. He asked her about the missing funds. She stumbled. He asked her why she approved my building plans if she believed they were dangerous. She dodged. He asked her directly if she truly believed one house could summon or redirect a hurricane. She hesitated for just 1 second too long. That hesitation was all it took. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The illusion shattered. When closing arguments ended, the jury didn't take long. Less than an hour later, they came back with the verdict. Not only did they rule in my favor, but they declared the HOA's lawsuit malicious and baseless. They ordered the HOA to pay all my legal fees. And on top of that, the judge referred their financial misconduct to state investigators. Deborah's face went pale as the gavel came down. Her red blazer suddenly looked like a warning sign, a beacon of her own downfall. Her fellow board members slumped in their seats like deflated balloons. It was over. They had lost. Walking out of that courthouse felt better than surviving the hurricane itself. Because the storm outside had been nature, but the storm inside my own neighborhood had been cruelty, corruption, and greed. And finally that storm was over. But the fallout was just beginning. News outlets picked up the verdict, and suddenly the whole country was talking about it. Headlines read, HOA loses $10 million lawsuit after blaming homeowner for hurricane. People flooded social media with outrage, calling Deborah and her board power-hungry tyrants. Some even joked about me being a real-life stormbreaker who had beaten both nature and bureaucracy. Within weeks, the state launched a full investigation into the HOA. Deborah resigned in disgrace, her little empire crumbling around her. The other board members scattered like leaves in the wind. By the end of the year, the HOA was dissolved entirely. The neighborhood voted to disband it and instead set up a simple community association with no power to fine or control anyone. For the first time since moving in, I could actually breathe. As for me, my house still stood tall, the only one untouched by the storm, a reminder that preparation and foresight matter. Neighbors who had once hissed at me slowly came around. Some apologized, others just quietly rebuilt without saying a word. I didn't hold grudges, I just focused on my family, my home, and the peace we finally had. Looking back now, I realize the hurricane was only half the battle. The real storm was the HOA, the corruption, the lies, and the lengths they went to protect themselves. But just like with the hurricane, I had built strong foundations. And that was what carried me through. So when people ask me if I regret building my house the way I did, I say absolutely not. Because not only did it save my family from the storm, it exposed the truth about the people who claimed to lead our community. And if I had to do it all again, I would. because at the end of the day the storm passed. But my house still stood. And so did I. If you enjoyed this crazy HOA story, make sure to hit that like button, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales just like this one. See you in the next story.